Please listen carefully.
We just thought we would bring a little piece of Minnesota with us today. You know, we all love Prince.
Yeah.
Is this mic on? Can you all hear me? Great. Is there anybody in the audience today that is from Minnesota? Right on, way there in the back. Woo-hoo. So much of what we're going to talk about then today might be new, and so we're glad to be able to share it with you. So while we're really proud of so many of the things that we have in Minnesota, including Prince, you know, magazines say that we're one of the best places to live in the nations. We also have the second worst racial disparities in the country. Only second to Wisconsin, right? And so what Nexus is doing is working to get us at the bottom of the list. We want to be 50. Nexus is a community building intermediary that works at the intersection of community-based organizations, community development corporations, philanthropy, government, and other large institutions. And so we work to knit those things together. And we do that by providing re-granting resources to our community partners, by providing technical assistance, bridging between those partners when there aren't existing relationships, and then also developing initiatives where the community has seen a gap. Just drew an unfortunate blank. One of the things that we've learned over time is that there needs to be three things to build just and equitable communities. And those three things are authorship, leadership, and ownership. Those are the three ships. And so that's what we want to have a conversation with you all today.
I'm just going to flip back for 1 second to also highlight that what we're talking about ultimately is equity, and equity is the center. It is the center of what we're doing. We're working towards achieving that. And here you can see the connections. We're talking about connecting authorship, leadership, and ownership, and what those things have in common, the intersection of those pieces and the relationship of those things. So I'm going to start off by talking about authorship. Now, this is an awesome diagram that we have up here that's super complicated and has lots of words. So I'm not actually going to talk about this for just, we're just going to leave it up there and have you live with that complicated diagram for just 3 or 4 minutes here before I can get around to it. But authorship is about a couple of things. One, clearly, as we all know about authorship and authors writing books or stories, that it's about telling stories. It's about sharing information. It's about narratives. Far too often, communities, particularly oppressed communities, are beholden to or burdened by the narratives, negative narratives. Narratives that come from big institutions or organizations. Oftentimes, those organizations or institutions are the ones who've created those problems in those negative narratives. But for communities, they have their own stories to tell. Stories, histories about the people living there, about the assets and the resources that they have within those communities. And so authorship is about giving people the opportunity and communities the opportunity to tell those stories and lead with what they have as resources in their communities. Another piece about authorship, let me actually just back up and say too, that part of that is about expertise. Who knows a community best? Who knows people best? Each of you probably know yourself the best. Of course, there are people like psychologists or loved ones who can read through you and cut through all the crap that you might be putting up, but you still know those things that they're telling you. Deep in your core, you know them, and you know yourself the best. And so communities are like that too. They know themselves. They know what they are about. They know what those assets are that are part of them. And so the other part of authorship is leading with that knowledge and that expertise. So authorship is about not just telling those stories and those histories, but about driving the future. Communities know what the problems they face are. They also know what the solutions are. They know what the opportunities are, and they know whether or not they want to seize them and how they want to seize them. It's about writing that future story. So how does a person go about doing this? How do you go about making sure that those are opportunities, especially when you're not from a community? Well, number one, and we talk about this a lot, is listening. Listening is really important. You heard that a couple of times, actually, the themes that people talked about before we got up here, listening. Now, I can teach you about listening, right? I can talk to you about how you sit there and you hear things and what active listening is. I'm really good at teaching that. I have 3 young kids. Well, actually, I'm probably terrible at teaching it if you actually hear them or see them attempt to listen. Truth is that I'm the only one they don't listen to. That's a badge of honor I think I wear as a parent, right? And I listen to them all the time, and they're ridiculous stories, but they don't listen to me. Especially when they're lying about something. But community engagement does have a skill set. They're active listening, facilitating meetings, and that's often what people want to learn about, and that's true. I mean, there is a skill set and there is an expertise. Our work is rooted in listening and learning from experts. A lot of the things that we talk about come from communities and come from people doing community engagement. And so there is a skill set, there is a field, there are people who do this for a living and know it. But more so than that, there is a root to community engagement. There's something beyond just those skills. And that's actually what this diagram is about. I told you I'd get there. So this is about, in the center there, those are the core pieces of community engagement, the core principles about talking about authorship. I don't know if I said this out loud before, but authorship, we equate it to community engagement, working with communities and having them lead. Now, at the center of that circle, there's several words. There's relationships, power, culture, spirituality, healing, and identity. And those are the things that we think you should think about as you engage with communities. Those are the contexts, those are the structures in which communities operate. Those are the pieces that are core to them. Culture's clear, right? There's languages, there's food, there's a sense of time, purpose, place, where people are from, and those are different from community to community, right? Skills like listening, that's applicable in different ways, right? Facilitating meaning can be applicable, but it all has to happen within a context, and culture is one of those pieces of that context. Healing is a big piece. There's a history to communities and how they interact with those institutions that I was talking about before, like government. What are the stories? What are the interactions? What's the trauma that has been caused by those institutions? That has a big impact on how communities might relate to them moving forward. So as you're trying to work with a community and solving a particular problem, you have to take that into account and think about what that looks like. You can't walk into a community and be the expert. You have to listen and work with and engage. And it's really important to take time to learn about those histories and that culture. The other thing I just wanted to talk about too with not being the expert when you lead with communities is that you have to be able to embrace ambiguity. You have to be able to think about and know or not know what the outcome might actually be. When you are working with a community, you don't know what that process might lead to. I'm told by my wife in particular that people are happier when they read spoilers for movies or TV shows. I'm definitely not one of those people. I love that constant anxiety of knowing whether or not my favorite Game of Thrones character is going to die in that episode. But that's the world that you have to live in. And if it makes you unhappy, it makes you unhappy. But you have to live with the unknown, right? And let the community lead and move forward. And one of the big things about community engagement and these principles is that not only are they the context for engaging, but they're actually strengthened. Relationships are strengthened. A sense of identity and culture can be strengthened when you work with a community. And another piece of that can be strengthened and emerge from in community engagement is leadership.
My name is Terry Tom, a program director at Nexus Community Partners. And as Avi mentioned, when we engage with communities, oftentimes leaders, what we think of our leaders, will naturally emerge from that process, right? You engage them in discussions, they help co-create or find their own solutions. And for us, and then leaders will emerge. And for us at Nexus, we believe that a strong, equitable, and just community is one in which all members are seen as leaders. They are given ample opportunities to grow in their leadership, and they're able to represent their communities at multiple tables and in multiple spaces. And for me, I've done this work through running a program that's a national adaptation called the Boards and Commissions Leadership Institute, where I've trained 4 amazing cohorts in the picture from various communities of color, indigenous communities, low wealth communities, to get them placed on public boards and commissions. And we're soon to start a 5th cohort next week. Here, what's really powerful about these group of leaders is that they're already holding themselves accountable to a community. I think typically when we thought of leadership, it's been the other way around. When you're the leader, you're accountable. But what we want to start the premise of our work with is that you're accountable from the beginning. We're accountable to our families. We're accountable to our communities, the different communities that we feel ourselves a part of. And when you're accountable to a community, that's what you bring to the table. That's what you're able to bring when you are at these decision-making tables. What we also know about these amazing fellows that I train is that they're already leaders in their own right. They are already doing amazing things in their community. They're advocating for, or they have a passion for this work, for environmental justice, for affordable housing, for workforce development, for making sure, for transit in their communities. So they're already doing things that are making a difference, but what they're missing sometimes is they really want an opportunity to practice their leadership to create more racially and economically equitable policies, and particularly at this hidden level of power on local, regional, or state boards or commissions. And so what have we learned about leadership, right? 4 cohorts in, we've learned a whole lot, but what we know that's intentional in our program is the power of networks and the power of networking, and that it's really important to acknowledge that it's not just what you know, but it's just as important as who you know. And and especially now with all these great social networking tools, we're more connected than ever, but how do we intentionally bridge and build those networks is key. And particularly our role at Nexus and through our program has been to intentionally connect our fellows, participants to folks in the nonprofit, for-profit, government sectors, and particularly on the issues that we are concerned about around economic development, health, housing, transit, and workforce. What we also have learned about leaders is connected to a point Avi was mentioning about healing, right? We often know we will send leaders, when we work on these issues of systems change, try to create economically and racially and economically equitable policies. That's some hard work, and we often will send folks into toxic spaces. And so we need to acknowledge that the healing work needs to happen from day one, and we need to think about it intentionally and build it in different ways. We build it into our programming, but that it needs to be core, because without that work, and some of it may be that accountability, maybe they go back to community as a form of healing, but that this really needs to be stated and practiced from the start. And for us, one of the biggest learnings is that when we've combined a multitude of these pieces around skills, networks, and looking at healing work, that particularly working on creating these policies, when we solve for the most vulnerable, we really do solve for everyone. And these are the types of leaders that we see as a result.
Consider myself a change agent. I don't like leaving power on the table, and boards and commissions are a part of that. They're committees that are tasked with very specific things that assist governments, particularly local and state governments, and frankly impact our day-to-day lives. A lot of us are just left out of that. People of color, women, etc., people on the margins. So that was really the biggest reason why I wanted to join the Boards and Commissions Leadership Institute. And what BCLI does is just kind of refine the skills that we already bring to the table to make sure they're better suited for the board or the commission that you're interested in becoming a part of. And so now when I sit on one of these boards or commissions, I know what I'm doing, I can make an impact, I have something I'm bringing to the table, and I can negotiate with the value that I bring to the table. BCLI was helpful in me getting on the workplace partnership group, working on passing paid sick time in the city of Minneapolis. I was the only black man on the entire group. I was also the youngest person on that group. I was dealing with senior vice president of Target, and I was dealing with EDs of nonprofits and all these bigwig folks. And here I am, a community organizer, at the same table as they were, with the same amount of power as they all had. And actually, through some of the negotiation skills that we practice in BCLI, I was the lead negotiator for the final ordinance that was passed by the city council. And passing paid sick time in the city of Minneapolis was, at the time, the largest commitment to racial equity that we've ever made as a city. If you are interested in being a leader, if you think that you are already a good leader in your community, but you're interested in polishing up some of those skills and becoming a better representative, a better voice for the people that you love and that you care about, you need to join BCLI.
Last but not least, when we invest in leaders, we get leaders like this dynamic young woman, Ilhan Omar, who's a state representative and was recently graced on the cover of Time because she's the first Somali American elected official in this country. So, we all do better when we all do better.
We certainly can't claim all of her greatness, Ilhan, but she is one of the first alumni of our BCLI program. Ownership. Nexus believes that to build just and equitable communities, that people need ample opportunities to build wealth and to own the wealth that they help to generate. And so that work lives in our community wealth building framework, which is a framework that acknowledges that current economic practices have largely failed communities of color, and some could say failed most people, and that community development efforts that focus on individual asset and wealth building alone cannot address or lift the deeply rooted racial disparities that we have in our country. And so community wealth building works to eliminate those disparities. Community wealth building is grounded in a set of values and principles that I think makes it different than other economic development frameworks. Those values are equity, as you can see through all of the work that we do. Mutuality, acknowledging that there's a reciprocity and a relationship that exists in communities. And stewardship. We are all stewards of resource in communities. Community wealth building is a place-based approach, right? We're looking at an ecosystem that exists in every community and really being intentional about developing relationships between different actors in the ecosystems and the resources that they bring to the table. So I want to talk about one of our partners, the Hmong American Farmers Association, as a way to lift up and make this community wealth building framework real for you folks. So Hmong people are an ethnic group from Laos and were uprooted from their land and forcibly removed and made to relocate in the 1970s after the Vietnam War. And many of those folks came to Minnesota. And so much was lost in that move. But what Hmong people brought were a rich cultural tradition and a set of assets that have allowed them to replant their roots in Minnesota. Much of that tradition is around agriculture. So in Minnesota, the Hmong people are really kind of these hidden figures behind this huge local food movement. $250 million annually goes into local foods. And so 50% of all the food that you find at the farmer's market comes from Hmong farmers. But it's often, people see the more urban agricultural folks as the foodies, as the food movement, when in fact in Minnesota it is Hmong farmers. And so you can guess then that Hmong farmers face significant barriers to coming to parity with their Anglo counterparts, right? So the Hmong American Farmers Association was founded by Paku Heng and her brother Jansen and a number of other Hmong farmers to say that we have the solutions to how we could do agriculture in Minnesota and how we can have thriving businesses. And so HAFA has developed a Whole Foods model that really gets at all these barriers. Land. HAFA operates a 155-acre farm in Dakota County that they help to leverage outside resources from a social investor to buy. It'll be converted into an agricultural land trust. So now the farmers have land so they can get access to capital. To get access to that capital, HAFA has started a business development program in partnership with community-based organizations, academic institutions, and financing providers, so that the farmers then have access to the things that they need to grow their business. So now they've grown their businesses, right? And so HAFA's Alternative Markets program gets contracts with large anchor institutions and the school system so that they operate a production cooperative. And so now thousands of people have access to healthy, locally grown food, especially the children in our elementary schools. So now what else do you do to the produce, right? You develop value-added markets. And so looking at what other investments have been made around local food. Often people hear about kitchen incubators, right? So they use a kitchen incubator, do training on food safety, pilot value-added products, sell them to grocery stores, right? Research. So because they steward the land and want to ensure that the healthy, rich soil in Minnesota continues to produce crops over time, they partner with the University of Minnesota's Land Grant University, it's a land grant, and to do cutting-edge crop research to make sure that, one, it's producing the kinds of vegetables and produce that Hoffa wants to grow, but that generations and generations and generations from now, that land is still healthy. So combined, all of these components of their whole foods model, this culturally based wealth-building model, has taken farmers from a place where they were barely subsisting to getting at parity and often surpassing Anglo farmers. And all of those resources then are brought back to their homes on the east side of St. Paul and lifting up that whole economy, right? We all do better when we all do better.
Thank you. This really quickly is another example of our authorship work. This is a group of individuals in a fellowship program through Nexus who are Black residents of North Minneapolis looking to start cooperatives at specific cultural and at this time it was geographic communities so that they could understand and work together through the history of their community and healing together as they were looking to develop cooperative businesses. So you've heard about authorship, leadership, and ownership. These things are all connected through their common purpose and goal, like we talked about, equity, but also in their core principles of culture, of history, of healing, and the fourth ship, which isn't really another ship, but it's the connection between those ships, relationships. We've talked about how you build relationships within people, within organizations with common goals, within systems and communities. And this takes time. It definitely takes time, but so does enacting failed policies year in and year out that aren't rooted in community, that aren't listening, that aren't building those networks and those connections that need to happen for them to be sustained. So how do you do this? Learn the culture, learn the history of the communities, know your own culture, know where you come from. Because if you don't know where you come from, it's going to be hard to learn about other people also. And build those relationships. Take that time, connect with people, and then the work will be better. Thank you so much for having us here. It's been wonderful to speak to you all. Hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you again.